All right, Chapter 4 of the High Liability book, Criminal Justice Defensive Tactics. Defensive tactics is a system of controlled defensive and offensive body movements that criminal justice officers use to respond to a subject's aggression or resistance. Fitness, strength, agility, balance, and flexibility are vital to developing these skills. The role of defensive tactics is to assist the officer in restraining or arresting a person. That's pretty important here. The role of defensive tactics is to assist the officer in restraining or arresting a person. Any defensive weapon or technique has the potential to cause injury, great bodily harm, or death, which is why it is so important to understand when and how to use appropriate techniques. Defensive tactics skills require physical fitness, strength, agility, balance, and flexibility. Because flexibility reduces the risk of injuries, do stretching exercises every day. A warm-up session raises the heart rate and increases blood circulation to the muscles, saturating them with oxygen, and this helps your body prepare itself for physical activity. Stretching usually begins with a warm-up, such as running in place, jumping jacks, etc., and do these exercises that last 15 to 30 minutes to warm up the muscles, increase the heart rate, respiration, and perspiration. So again, 15 to 30 minutes for warm-up. I'm not going to go through these warm-up exercises. They weren't on the block exam, and they probably won't be on the SOC. Falling techniques. Falling properly reduces the potential for injury and minimizes the stunning effect associated with falling, so you can assume an effective defensive position. Make sure to fall forward to a prone position, which is lying on the stomach face down, contacting the ground with the palms, forearms, and feet, turning your head to the side, and exhaling on impact. Then you have your rear fall, side fall, and those are the falls. So remember, with all of these steps, the first step with all of these types of falls are loud, clear verbal commands throughout the technique. So if they ask, what's the first step? It's just clear, loud, verbal commands. Then you have your foundation position. This position allows you to be ready to engage the subject on the ground or to recover to a standing position. Posting is supporting the balance of the body using a limb. Hip escapes. These allow you to move from side to side to avoid or defend against an attack. The movement in a hip escape is also known as shrimping. So again, shrimping is also hip escapes. Then we have the sprawl, which is usually used to defend against a subject who shoots in for a takedown. So if the question comes up, person shooting in for a takedown, what do? That would be a sprawl to get out of that. Then you have your recommended cool-downing stretches. I'm not going to go through those. Pummeling drill. Pummeling is a grappling technique used to gain the double underhook position, which is a dominant control position that can be used in a variety of takedowns and grappling techniques. For example, the front takedown. An overhook is when your arm is over the subject's arm and controlling that arm. An underhook is when your arm is under the subject's arm and controlling the subject's upper body. So again, pummeling is a grappling technique, and that would be the pummeling drill. The arm drag drill. The arm drag is a technique where you pull the subject's arm across your body to gain a dominant position. You can use the arm drag to set up a variety of grappling and takedown techniques, for example, the escort position or rear takedown. Cardiovascular conditioning is any exercise that elevates the heart rate to a range of 60 to 85% of the maximum rate. So I know this was on the block exam, could be on the SOC. Cardiovascular training, exercise that elevates the heart rate in the range of 60 to 85% of the maximum rate. Then we move on to nutrition. These following things under nutrition were definitely on the block exam, potentially the SOC. Veggies, make sure you know your sources of protein. Meat, poultry, eggs, legumes such as lentils, milk and milk products, vegetables, nuts, seeds, seafood, and grain. So those are sources of protein. Ones that stick out are vegetables. On the test, I think there was lentils potentially, and I think there was grains and nuts were on the test. Protein provides energy, builds and repairs body cells, is part of various enzymes, hormones, and antibodies. And the function and the sources were both on the test in different various ways. So make sure you know the functions of the nutrients and the sources of them. So function of carbohydrate provides energy needed by the brain, nervous system, red blood cells, and other cells. Sources could be bread, cereal grains, pasta, rice, fruit, vegetables, milk, and sugar. So remember, with carbohydrates, it's energy for the brain, nervous system, red blood cells, and other cells. And on the test, I think it was asking about grains, pasta, and I think fruit. It was something along those lines. And then fat provides energy and essential fatty acids, carries other fat-soluble nutrients such as vitamins, is part of cell membranes around the nerves, hormones, and bile for fat digestion. Sources of fat are meat, poultry, fish, milk, and milk byproducts, nuts and seeds, oils, butter, margarine, and salad dressing. Salad dressing was definitely on there if I remember correctly. So protein. So all three of these provide energy. So let's not focus on that here. Protein builds and repairs body cells. That's the real part there with protein. So they build and repair body cells. Carbohydrates, that's energy for the brain and nervous system. Fat provides essential fatty acids, so that's easy to remember. Fat-soluble nutrients such as vitamins and hormones. So remember that with fat. And with protein and carbohydrates, vegetables are both a source from there. Remember with fat, think of like butter, margarine, salad dressing, oils, milk. And then when you get to carbohydrates, think more of breads, pastas, rice, things that are thick, a lot of, high in carbs. And then you have your protein, think of meat, eggs, poultry, milk, vegetables, seeds, nuts, things like that. Then we move on to Unit 2, Lesson 1, Force Guidelines. Again, Chapter 776 of the Florida Statutes governs all use of force by criminal justice officers. Use of force applied equally to corrections and correctional probation officers, like we already talked about. The statutes identify 2 general areas where an officer's use of force is justified: to apprehend and arrest a subject, or to defend self or others. 77605 addresses the issue of an officer using force. So 77605 is really any force. We're allowed to make an arrest because of resistance or threatened resistance to the arrest. We're allowed to use defensive tactics, which he or she reasonably believes to be necessary to defend himself or herself or another from bodily harm while making the arrest. 2, when necessarily committed in retaking felons who have escaped. Or 3, when necessarily committed in arresting felons fleeing from justice. So again, defending yourself or others, retaking felons who have escaped, and arresting felons fleeing from justice. Chapter 944 of the Florida Statutes addresses the use of force specifically by state correctional and probational officers. All right, then we move on to objective reasonableness. The courts use objective reasonableness to decide whether an officer's use of force is appropriate response to a subject's resistance. Appropriate force is the amount of force reasonably necessary to make an arrest. So I know that was on the test. Appropriate force is the amount of force reasonably necessary to make an arrest. Make sure you know what objective reasonableness is, and make sure you know the court ruling of Graham v. Connor, that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of how a reasonable officer on the scene would respond rather than from 20/20 perspective of hindsight. So Graham v. Connor is your use of force, and it's what a normal reasonable officer would do with objective reasonableness. The Supreme Court has made clear that use of force is a seizure under the Fourth Amendment. Correctional officers must also consider that use of force may violate the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Authority to use force. Make sure before you use force that the stop is legal. Much litigation against criminal justice officers is not about the amount of force used, but whether the use of force was permitted at all. Though the law grants criminal justice officers the right to use force, this right is conditioned on their official authority. So you have to be where you are at legally to begin with. You can't just go somewhere illegally and then see force being used against you and then react, because it's like, well, why were you there to begin with? So just keep that in mind. An officer's goal is to achieve subject compliance. Compliance is the verbal or physical yielding to an officer's authority without apparent threat of resistance or violence. So again, compliance is verbal or physical yielding. Escalation is increasing the use of force or resistance. De-escalation is decreasing the use of force or resistance. Disengagement is discontinuing a command or physical use of force, for example, by breaking away from a subject. The officer's choices are determined by the subject's action and the risk of physical harm posed to the officer or others. In all of the defensive tactics you employ, remember that the subject's safety is your responsibility. Structure of the force guidelines. The force guidelines provide a framework for making decisions involving the reasonable use of force by criminal justice officers. So if they're asking what provides a framework for making decisions involving the reasonable use of force, that would be the force guidelines that was on the block exam. Subject resistance levels. We're going to start with passive resistance, and then it moves to active resistance, then aggressive resistance, and then deadly force resistance. So passive resistance is the person is doing nothing to anyone. Active resistance, they are evading you. Aggressive resistance, they are attacking you. And deadly force, they are causing great bodily harm or death. So passive resistance is a subject's verbal or physical refusal to comply with an officer's lawful direction, causing the officer to use physical techniques to establish control. So again, passive is they're not doing anything to you, they're not doing anything to anyone, they're just not complying with any of your directions. They're being passive. Active resistance, again, that's evading you. This is a subject's use of physical evasive movements directed towards the officer, such as bracing, tensing, pushing, pulling to prevent the officer from establishing control over you. Examples would be the person hanging onto you, pulling away from you, trying to run once you go to grab them. Those are examples of active. I forgot to include the examples of passive real quick. They refuse to move, they refuse to leave, they refuse to take their hands out of their pockets. Those are all passive. Again, active is they're hanging on you, they're bracing, pulling, tensing, they're trying to run when you grab them. Then we move on to aggressive resistance, which is what I said is attacking you. This is hostile attacking movements that may cause injury but are not likely to cause death or great bodily harm to the officer or others. Some examples of aggressive resistance include the subject balls up their fists and approaches the officer. The subject pushes the officer back as the officer tries to take them into custody. The subject grabs any part of the officer's body. That would be aggressive. Then we move on to deadly force. This type of resistance is hostile attacking movements with or without a weapon that create a reasonable perception by the officer that the subject intends to cause and has the capability of causing death or great bodily harm to the officer or others. Examples of deadly force were being the subject refuses to drop a knife when ordered, the subject shoots or points a gun at an officer, the subject uses a vehicle to try to run down an officer. Then you have officer response options. So the first response option is command presence and verbal communication will often diffuse many situations. So I know the test was a little confusing. It shows that your response options are here, and it kind of shows four of them: officer presence, command presence, physical control, and less lethal. And on the test, they asked the question, what is your first thing you should do? I had put officer presence because it's showing, okay, that's the first one here. That wasn't the case. So in the paragraph right below officer response options, it basically says, try to resolve a situation with the least amount of force necessary. Command presence and verbal communication often will diffuse many volatile situations. So basically the correct answer for the test was verbal communication and talking them down. That was your first response. So then we'll go into your next response, which is officer presence. This is your ability to convey to subjects and onlookers that you are able and ready to take control. So that's just presence. It's the fact that you're there, you're ready to take control. That would be like your attitude and stuff. Then you go to command presence is your next level. This is your demeanor and the way you exhibit confidence through erect posture, alertness, attention to surroundings, and it is how you carry yourself. Then we move on to physical control. This is achieving compliance or custody through the use of empty hand or leverage enhanced techniques, such as pain compliance, transporters, restraint devices, takedowns, and striking techniques. These techniques will be discussed later in this chapter. Remember that empty hand are strikes and kicks, where leverage enhanced techniques are tools. So again, physical control is achieving compliance or custody through the use of empty hand, which are strikes or kicks, or leverage enhanced techniques, which are your tools like your baton, tasers, things like that. A less lethal weapon is not fundamentally designed to cause death or great bodily harm. Some examples include electronic control devices, conducted electrical weapons, expandable batons, flashlights, and chemical agent sprays. And those are less lethal weapons under physical control. 77606, remember that has to do with deadly force. The term deadly force means force that is likely to cause death or great bodily harm. Remember, that would be, like I mentioned in the previous chapter, firing of a firearm at a vehicle where the suspect is in, firing of a firearm in the direction of the person to be arrested. Those are two ones that are definitely deadly force. The decision to use deadly force is a serious one. Base your decision to use deadly force as a defensive tactic on a clear, reasonable belief that you, a fellow officer, or another person faces imminent danger or death or great bodily harm. Officers have a legal responsibility to prevent excessive use of force or intervene during an excessive use of force encountered by other officers. Section 943 of the Florida statutes define excessive use of force as force that exceeds the degree of force permitted by law, policy, or the observing officer's employed agency. To intervene, an on-duty officer must 1. Observe another officer engaging or attempting to engage in excessive use of force. 2. Choose an intervention that is reasonable based on the totality of circumstances. And 3. Not jeopardize their own health or safety. Factors for deciding to use deadly force. Officers use 3 criteria for making deadly force decisions: ability, opportunity, and intent. Ability refers to the subject having the means to carry out their intent to cause death or great bodily harm. So ability is he's able to do it. So he has the means. So for example, a weapon's not required. The subject only has the apparent ability to carry out the intent. So, for example, a 6'4", 200-pound muscular man threatening to do bodily harm to an officer does not necessarily need a weapon. Just by virtue of their size and physical condition, they have the apparent ability. So because they're big, because they're strong, maybe they have a weapon, that means they have the ability to do it, which is he's able to do it. Then you have the opportunity, which means he can do it now. Opportunity means the subject is capable of acting on a plan to cause death or great bodily harm to the officer or others. So a suspect armed with a knife is perhaps not an immediate threat to an officer standing far away. However, the same person standing closer or carrying a firearm has the opportunity. So opportunity is about how soon can he do it. And then intent is that he wants to do it. So intent is the subject's intention to voluntarily make the bodily movement that becomes the act to commit a criminal offense. It is a perception derived from the totality of circumstances. So intent is that he wants to do it. He's making the movements to do it. Then we move on to totality of circumstances. This test, the totality of circumstances test, considers the overall facts of a situation to determine if you had the authority to detain someone for committing a crime or to perform a legal search. So the overall facts of a situation determine if you have the legal authority to detain for committing a crime or to perform a search. That's the totality of circumstances. All right, now we have the four guidelines, which are the decision-making process. The first one is subject resistance. Is the subject verbally or physically resisting my lawful authority? Is the subject making attacking movements that are likely to cause death or bodily harm? Is the subject making attacking movements that are likely to cause death or great bodily harm? Okay, they are or they aren't causing bodily harm. So that's subject resistance. Are they verbally or physically resisting, and are they or are they not making attacking movements? Then it moves to situational factors. What subject factors influence this situation? Weapon, physical size, demeanor, others. What officer factors influence this situation? Training, experience, physical size. What environmental factors influence the situation, such as weather, location, presence of others. Then you move to officer response. Can I physically control the subject? Could I use a less lethal weapon not meant to cause death or great bodily harm? Is deadly force the appropriate action to prevent death or great bodily harm to myself or others? Then your justification. Were my actions reasonable based on the subject's resistance and the totality of circumstances? Am I able to articulate the reasons for my actions? And was I in compliance with constitutional and state laws, agency policies, and training? All right, survival stress reaction. Survival stress is sometimes called fear-induced stress or combat stress. Survival stress is the body and mind's response to a perceived threat. You can react to survival stress in four ways: fight, flight, posture, or submit. To submit is to completely relinquish control to another. Do not confuse that with compliance, that is verbally or physically complying and listening and obeying the officer, where submit is to completely relinquish control to another. Remember that survival stress can also be called fear-induced or combat stress and is the body and mind's response. And there are four: fight, flight, posture, or submit. All right, then we go to physiological changes under stress, which have to do with your body changes. Increased heart rate, diminished or amplified hearing, distorted vision, loss of bladder control, increased reaction time, motor performance changes. There are three motor performance changes. You can have loss of fine motor skills. Fine motor skills are the muscle control required to make small, precise movements, such as unlocking handcuffs with a key. Then you have heavier reliance on gross motor skills. Gross motor skills are movements of the large or major muscles of the body to do things like run, punch, or kick. And then you have loss of complex motor skills, tasks that require a combination of fine and gross motor skills using hand-eye coordination timed to a single event, such as driving a vehicle. Or you can have a complete breakdown of motor skills, freezing or submitting. So again, your fine motor skills, small details, gross motor skills, larger things like kicking, punching, and then your complex motor skills, which are a combination of both of those things. All right. Then you have decision-making under stress. You can offset this issue by increasing your training. So basically, your brain will make shortcut decisions based on your training. You can offset these issues by increasing your training. Okay, speech patterns under stress. An officer may speak emotionally or without thinking on the scene and after an incident. The officer may curse, brag, or boast. This phenomenon might be called exhilaration speech, which are statements brought on by a euphoric feeling of accomplishment after prevailing in a critical incident. Then we have threat awareness. The threat awareness spectrum is an illustration of how survival stress may affect your reaction to a perceived challenge or threat. Your desired state of awareness while in routine duty is condition yellow. This is the optimum state of mind to remain focused while scanning for potential problems. From condition yellow, you can quickly move to condition orange or condition red based on the situation. Condition white and condition black are not optimum states of readiness while on duty. So let's go through this chart real quick. We have condition white, you're unaware that a threat exists. Condition yellow, general awareness of possible threats. Again, that is the optimal condition for every day. Condition orange, recognition that a threat exists. Condition red, specific threat identified and appropriate actions taken. And then condition black, threat mismanaged due to panic stress response. So condition white would be person driving to work, being on autopilot, not remembering. Condition yellow would be while on the job, an officer is in a state of relaxed awareness and notices what is going on. Condition orange would be A patrol officer potentially seeing something that could look like a potential crime going on, but they're not sure, but it's a recognition that a threat could exist. Condition red would be the patrol officer initiates the plan to engage the suspects as they exit the store. That would be condition red. You're actually, you identify the threat and then you're taking the actions. And then condition black is, you panicking, or you not doing anything, or you using the wrong level of force. Okay, fundamental principles of defensive tactics. We start with balance, which is maintaining a balanced posture is essential in performing any technique. Balance displacement is a controlling technique used to break the subject balance through the use of leverage principles. I remember that being on the block exam. Balance displacement, controlling technique used to break the subject's balance. Leverage is using a great force against a weaker resistance. Pain compliance is a subject response to a combination of pain and verbal commands to stop resisting. That was on the block exam. So was leverage. Again, pain compliance is subject response to a combination of pain and verbal. Mechanical compliance, an officer may gain control over a subject by applying pressure or leverage to a joint by locking it up so that no movement of the joint is possible. Joint manipulation, an officer may gain control over a subject by bending or twisting a joint in a direction that will cause pain or discomfort to the joint. Don't get joint manipulation and mechanical manipulation confused. Mechanical compliance is applying pressure or leverage on a joint by locking it so it's not able to move. So mechanical is they can't move, or joint manipulation is basically bending or twisting a joint to cause pain. So joint manipulation is using the joint to cause pain. Mechanical compliance is using the joint so that the person can't move. Then you have motor dysfunction. An officer may gain control over a subject by using an incapacitation technique that causes temporary impairment of muscular control. Again, incapacitation techniques that causes temporary impairment. That's motor dysfunction. Then you have a penetrating strike. When delivering a strike, an officer strikes a muscle so that the striking object penetrates the muscles and nerves of the target area. This is a full transfer of kinetic energy. This is penetrating strike. Then you have a clinch. This is a technique that involves holding a person tightly in a close position. You can use the clinch when striking techniques to transition to a takedown or as a stalling technique. All right, then we have communication and commands. Communication is exchanging information through verbal and nonverbal methods. Communication provides valuable insight into the likelihood of cooperation and compliance of a subject. These are on the test here. Communication, dialogue, verbal direction, and touch. So again, communication is exchanging information through verbal and nonverbal. Dialogue is a controlled, unemotional communication between an officer and a subject aimed at problem solving and communication. So remember the difference between communication and dialogue. Communication is just exchanging information through verbal and nonverbal, where dialogue is a problem-solving conversation. So just remember the word problem-solving. Then you have verbal direction is the use of proper, clear, and concise commands to let a person know what you need or expect them to do. Touch is a non-threatening, non-custodial physical contact and can be used to support or emphasize a verbal command. It can be effective to enhance your communication. However, before applying touch, consider its use carefully to avoid escalating a person's resistance. Then we move on to threat assessment and response. How you assess a situation and the level of threat you perceive will influence how you respond. Subject behaviors and nonverbal cues may include increased breathing, stopping of all movement, clenched fists, refusal to show palms of hands, reddened or flushed face, prominent expanding veins on face or forearms, shifting of shoulders, glancing at a target area, ignoring the officer, and rapid angry movements. Then we go to excited delirium. Unusual symptoms or behavior is sometimes attributed to a condition known as excited delirium. It is defined in greater detail in first aid, which we went over, and it is someone experiencing excited delirium may overheat easily, be hostile, and show superhuman strength. And then people dying in custody is obviously sudden in custody death syndrome, SICDS, which we covered in first aid as well. All right, make sure you know about environmental factors, weather conditions, traffic, things like that. Remember that stances refer to how you stand when you interact with the subject or when they approach you. And then we go to our interview stance. You're going to stand with your head, hips, and feet aligned, gun side back. Then you have your offensive ready stance, which is just your interview stance, but you're slightly bending your knees a little bit and angling your body so your strong side is away, and you're placing your hands just below eye level. Then we move on to relative positioning, which describes where you stand or position yourself in relation to the subject. Then, which leads us into our reactionary gap. A distance of 25 feet if you do not have visible control of the subject's hands, or a distance of 6 to 9 feet if you have visible control of a subject's hands. So with your reactionary gap, 25 feet if you can't see their hands, or 6 to 9 feet if you can see their hands. Make sure to not be within the danger zone. This is anywhere inside the reactionary gap. So distance of 25 feet if you don't see their hands, or 6 to 9 feet if you have visible control. If you're within that, that is called the danger zone. Body movement refers to how you approach a subject or enter a scene. The reactionary gap is the distance you must keep between you and the subject to react effectively against a sudden threat. Again, 6 to 9 feet, with visible control of the hands, or 25 feet if you cannot see their hands. Inside the reactionary gap is the danger zone, as I said. Visual control of the hands is the ability to see both the subject's hands and to know that they are not holding any weapons. When approaching a subject, you may use the following hand clearing technique: maintain the reactionary gap, scan the area for threats, assume an appropriate stance, identify yourself as an officer, use clear, concise verbal commands, and tell the subject to expose both palms. Reaction time principle. This is the amount of time it takes for the brain to process a physical threat and the body to respond. So again, that's reaction time principle, and that's how long it takes your brain to assess and then respond. Evasion and redirection. Evasion is simply shifting your body to or sidestepping to avoid the attack. Redirection is using empty hand techniques to move the subject away. So redirection, you're moving them away. Evasion is you're stepping out of the way. Now we have pressure points, which are techniques used to control resistant behavior by using pain compliance. You have two main components of pressure point techniques. You have touch pressure and stabilization. So touch pressure is touching the location of a nerve or sensitive area and applying continual, uninterrupted pressure with the tip of the fingers or thumb until the subject complies. Stabilization is immobilizing the subject's head so the subject cannot move or escape. Be careful not to apply too much pressure or torque to the neck or spine when stabilizing the head. So stabilization has to do with the head. Touch pressure has to do with finding nerves or sensitive area and applying continual control. Remember that touch pressure and pain and pressure points are different. Pressure points are techniques used to control behavior by using pain, where touch pressure is just the action of touching the location of a sensitive area. Touch pressure is touching location. Pressure points are techniques. So pressure point techniques would be under the jaw. Use this technique when you want a seated, kneeling, or prone subject to stand up because you're pulling upwards under their jaw. That was on the test, so it was hollow behind the ear. Use this technique on a seated or prone subject or on a subject who is holding onto a fixed object. So hollow behind the ear, you will be using this to, you get this to also make somebody stand up. So if they're seated or prone, you do the hollow behind the ear, which would make them stand up, or if they're holding onto a fixed object, they would take it off. Make sure to decrease the pressure when the subject complies, but do not release control, just the pressure. If the subject begins to resist again, reapply the pressure. Now, to get someone to sit down, they use the hollow behind the collarbone. Use this technique when you want a standing subject to sit, lie down, or move to another location. That is the hollow behind the collarbone. Then elbow under the shoulder blade. Use this technique to reach the arms or wrists, for example, for handcuffing of a subject who is on their stomach with their hands tucked under them. So that's elbow under the shoulder blade. Escorts and transporters. The escort position is a technique used to move a subject from one point to another without using pain compliance. So again, escort, no pain compliance, you're just moving them. If the subject resists, you may move to a transporter technique, which is pain compliance. Okay. You guys know what the escort position is. Then we move to transporters. Transporters, sometimes called come-along holds. That was on the test. So another name for come-along hold was a transporter and vice versa. Transporters, sometimes called come-along hold, are techniques used to move a subject from one point to another with pain compliance or mechanical compliance. You have your hammer lock and your shoulder lock. Those are transporters. Your hammer lock transporter. The hammer lock is a useful technique applied when a subject tries to pull away from the escort position. Let's see. Hammer lock is where you bend their arm behind their back, and with your fingers you bend their middle finger inward towards you. Pain. Then you have your shoulder lock transporter. The shoulder lock transporter is a good controlling technique because of the position in which you put the subject's arm. So you're basically locking their arm up. You're kind of doing the whole waiter thingy by lifting the arm up and flipping it under your arm and locking it in that way. Restraint devices are tools such as handcuffs that are designed to temporarily restrain a subject's movement. So different ones could be waist chains, leg restraints, flexible leg restraints, things like that. Then you have handcuffs. These are temporary restraint devices frequently used to control a subject. So don't get restraint devices confused with handcuffs. Handcuffs are temporary restraint devices, and restraint devices are tools such as handcuffs that are designed to temporarily restrain a subject's movements. Make sure you know the nomenclature of a handcuff. You have your keyway, you have your cheek plate, your double lock, your swivels, your paw, which is where the bottom of your wrist, the bottom side of your wrist would touch against the cuff, your double strand, and then your single strand, and then the teeth. Make sure you know the 3-point pin. This is used to control the subject for handcuffing. All right, moving handcuffs. You're going to do all your little techniques you're learning DT. Your waist chains, your leg restraints, flexible restraints. Flexible leg restraints are also called hobbles, and these are a useful tool for restraining a subject who is kicking, trying to run away, or posing a safety threat. Frisks and searches. A search is a governmental intrusion into a place in which a person has a reasonable expectation of privacy. So remember, with a search, like I said in the Chapter 3 legal, is government, intrusion, and reasonable expectation of privacy. 3 search techniques are typically used in a defensive tactics context: a pat-down, a custodial search, and an inmate search. A pat-down is a physical frisk of the subject conducted in a predetermined pattern to locate weapons. Before a law enforcement officer may conduct a pat-down, they must have reasonable suspicion that the subject is armed. So that's the Terry stop and frisk. You guys know that one. Terry v. Ohio. Reasonable suspicion means that facts or circumstances exist that reasonably indicate that the person is committing, or is about to commit a violation of the law. So again, with a pat-down, aka Terry frisk, you have to have reasonable expectation that they have a weapon on them. All right. Then we move to... under the plain touch and feel doctrine, the officer may seize any object whose contour or mass the officer identifies as apparent contraband. That is Minnesota v. Dickerson. A law enforcement officer may pat down only the outside of the clothing for weapons. So that would be, you can see my dick son, which means you know what that is based on touching it, right? So plain feel, plain touch, Minnesota v. Dickerson. You can only pat down the outside of the clothing for weapons. Custodial search technique. This is used when a subject is taken into custody in an unsecured environment. Unlike the pat-down, this is a complete search of the vehicle. Custodial search technique, you would use this when putting them into your police car, searching them again before you get to the jail, things like that. Again, this is used when the subject is taken into custody in an unsecured environment. Perform a custodial search of a subject in a systematic and predetermined pattern using the quadrant search approach. That was definitely on the block exam. This divides the body into 4 sections, horizontally and vertically. So again, that's the quadrant search approach. I'm not going to go into the inmate search techniques because we don't do that. Just know that there's a closed search, a strip search, and a body cavity search. Blocks and strikes. Blocks are reaction techniques using the arm, legs, or body to deflect or redirect an impending strike from a subject to areas of the body. You have an upper area block, you have a mid area block, and then we move on to strikes. An empty hand striking technique is any impact technique using hands, arms, elbows, feet, legs, knees, or head to strike a subject in an offensive or defensive situation. Temporary motor dysfunction is a type of incapacitation that causes temporary impairment of muscle control, such as a cramp. Strikes to the skeletal structure are also effective. Okay, then we move on to target areas for empty hand strikes. With empty hand strikes, the only deadly force area is the throat. So even the side of the neck is not a deadly area. So you can hit anywhere except the throat straight on. So you can hit the side of the neck. That is not deadly force. Again, with empty hand, the only deadly force is the throat. A penetrating strike is typically used to strike a muscle. A snapback strike is delivered and then retracted very quickly, thus enabling multiple strikes, creating distance, setting up for the next techniques, and causing distraction to the subject. So again, penetrating strike, you're striking through the muscle. Swinging and thrusting are 2 types of strikes. A swinging strike generates less power on impact due to the greater amount of surface area on the target. A thrusting strike magnifies the delivered power due to the smaller surface area making contact with the target area. So again, these were actually on the test here. Swinging and thrusting are 2 types of strikes. And then remember, so these were on the test and it was kind of confusing. There's 2 methods of delivering strikes, and then there are 2 types of strikes. So methods of delivering strikes are penetration and snapback. That's how you deliver them. And then 2 types of strikes would be swinging and thrusting. Swinging generates less power because you have greater area of surface, but thrusting is more power because of smaller area of surface. Then we have a diversion. This is a technique that interrupts the subject's concentration so that energy is redirected from the current focus. Palm heel strike. You can use the palm heel strike to diffuse a situation and gain control of the subject. This strike may be delivered to the center of the subject's chest, primarily as a diversionary technique, or to the face as an incapacitating technique. All right, you have your hammer fist strike is one of the most powerful strikes you can use. So keep that in mind. The most powerful you can use is the hammer strike. Then you have the back fist strike. This is good when attacking from the rear. A properly delivered back fist strike can often give you a tactical advantage and may incapacitate or break the concentration of the attacker. Elbow strike. This could be an initial or follow-up strike to incapacitate the subject and create distance. Make sure you do this about 1 inch above or below the elbow. Then you have your knee strike. You can use the knee strike when you're near a resistant or combative subject. Used to gain control or distance. Your front kick. When an aggressive subject advances towards you, use the front kick to stop the subject's forward momentum. Angle kick. The angle kick can disable a subject who begins to attack you. For maximum effectiveness, use a penetrating strike. All right. And unfortunately, we're just a little past halfway here. Takedowns. Takedowns are techniques used to bring a resisting subject from a standing position to the ground, making it easier to control them. You have your straight arm takedown and the hammer lock takedown. You have your shoulder lock takedown, your rear takedown, your front takedown, and your hip roll. So know all those. Grappling is the use of body mechanics to leverage or control another person. Defend and escape from a front chokehold. Make sure you know that the front chokehold is life-threatening, and make sure to execute this technique immediately. So the front chokehold is life-threatening. Make sure you know defend and escape from rear chokehold, escape from front body holdover, escape from rear body, escape from headlock, escape from side headlock, escape from front headlock, escape from front football tackle. Again, from the front football tackle, you're going to do the sprawl. Diversions. These diversion techniques inflict pain and can temporarily divert a subject's attention, redirecting the subject's attack. They can also use to gain space. So types of diversions could be headbutts, foot stomps, and shin scrapes. Then we move on to vascular neck restraints. Vascular neck restraints should only be used when deadly force is authorized as per recommendations in both the 2020 National Consensus Policy and the Florida Police Chiefs Association Report, Use of Force Policy and Related Issues. The vascular neck restraint, this was also on the block exam. The vascular neck restraint compresses certain veins and arteries in the neck to cause a subject to lose consciousness briefly. This technique is not to be confused with the chokehold. So again, the vascular neck restraint is compressing veins and arteries to make them lose consciousness. Section 943 defines a chokehold as the intentional and prolonged application of force on the throat, windpipe, or airway of another person that prevents the intake of air. So a chokehold is preventing the intake of air. Vascular neck restraint is compressing veins so that they lose consciousness. Because this is a vascular restraint, releasing the hold will quickly replenish the blood flow and immediately revive the subject. The subject should regain consciousness within about 30 seconds, if not, render medical aid. Then we move on to ground control. Ground fighting is an anaerobic physical activity that will quickly tire you. A ground fight is exhausting and requires tremendous bursts of energy for short periods. Stalling is a tactical method of safely controlling a suspect until you physically recover or reassess the situation or backup arrives. So again, stalling is a tactical method of safely controlling the subject until backup arrives. All right, ground defensive positions. You have your guard. In the guard, one person is on their back with the other person positioned between your legs. Then you have the guard stall. You're holding them close to you. Your guard break. You're using your knee or your elbows to break away out of someone's guard. You have side control. This is the most basic of the stalling positions, is side control. So keep that in mind with side control. It's the most basic of the stalling position. Then you have your full mount. A full mount is considered the most dominant position in ground fighting. So full mount, most dominant ground position. Then you have your full mount stall and your bridge and roll. So with the bridge and roll, the object of this technique is to defend and escape. From the supine position, just remember what the supine position is. This is lying on the back face up. So you're lying on your back face up. That is a supine position. Let's see, you got an elbow escape, defend and escape from rear mount. Now we're moving on to Unit 3, Lesson 13, Impact Weapons, and we have about 6 or 7 pages left. Intermediate weapons are tools used when empty-handed control is ineffective, but the subject's level of resistance does not merit deadly force. An impact weapon is any object used for striking. Impact weapons may disable or cause temporary motor dysfunction. The most common types of intermediate weapons include the following: impact weapons such as batons or weapons of opportunity, specialty impact weapons such as beanbag rounds, or baton rounds. Electronic control devices such as a CW or a dart-firing stun gun, and chemical agents. Those are intermediate weapons. And again, an impact weapon is any object used for striking. The most common impact weapon is the baton. So keep that in mind. If they ask what's the most common impact weapon, that is a baton. The baton is not the only impact weapon available to an officer. Any item an officer has at hand may be used as a potential impact weapon when needed, such as a broomstick, a flashlight, a clipboard, or a radio. These unconventional impact weapons are also known as weapons of opportunity. That was on the block exam. So it's impact weapon and intermediate weapons. So all these unconventional impact weapons are weapons of opportunity, basically whatever you can grab in the moment to defend yourself. An interview stance with an impact weapon is a low-profile stance with the weapon held partially hidden behind the leg. That was on the test as well. So remember, interview stance with an impact weapon is low profile and you're hiding it behind your leg. An offensive ready stance with an impact weapon. This is a high-profile stance with the weapon held at shoulder position to enable a rapid strike. An impact weapon can strike specific target areas. So when you have an offensive ready, when you have a high-profile stance and you're using a impact weapon, your deadly force areas are the head, the side of the neck, the throat, and the groin. So if you're using an impact weapon, again, that is the head, that is the neck and throat, and the groin. But remember, if you have open hand strikes, the only area is the throat. But again, with impact weapons, that's the head, side of the neck, the throat, and the groin. Electronic control devices. Electronic control devices, ECDs, or electronic immobilization devices use a high voltage, low power electrical charge. So remember, as we discussed in the dart firing stun gun and then CEW one, CEWs use high voltage but low power electrical charges. Types of electronic control devices include CEWs, conduct electrical weapons, handheld stun gun, electronic shields, electronic belts, and electronic sleeves. So again, electronic control devices are the overarching for all the other types of weapons. Electronic control devices, ECDs. All right, chemical agents. Criminal justice officers primarily use two types of chemical agents to control resistant subjects. You have OC, which is olorezin capsicum, or CS, orthochlorobenzol malonyl trial. So again, OC and CS. OC is commonly called pepper spray. It is an inflammatory agent that causes tearing and involuntary closing of the eyes, nasal discharge, sneezing, disorientation, and a sensation of respiratory distress. So OC is the one we got sprayed with on spray day. It is commonly called pepper spray, and this was on the test that it is an inflammatory agent. Tearing and involuntary closing of the eyes. Where CS is an irritant. So remember that CS is an irritant, and OC is an inflammatory agent. So CS causes burning and tearing eyes, nasal discharge, and skin and upper respiratory irritation. This chemical, when making contact with the skin, gives a sensation of pain by activating and irritating the neurotransmitters of the body. Gives you an intense burning feeling. So again, remember, this was on the test. With OC, it's inflammatory, and CS is irritant. Contents of OC spray. Olorezin capsicum is a natural derivative of the cayenne pepper, although there are some synthetic forms. The active ingredient in OC is known as capsaicin, which produces the heat felt when it makes contact with human tissue. So active ingredient is capsaicin. The heat value of capsicum is measured in Scoville heat units, SHU. Again, that's Scoville heat units. The SHU scale was originally designed for determining the heat properties, burning sensations, and peppers for the restaurant industry. Bell peppers are at the low end of the scale, and cayenne pepper is higher on the scale. Effects of OC. Any of the following factors could influence the results of the OC. A poorly placed spray where the OC does not make contact with the subject's face, the subject mindset, or past experience with the chemical agent, drug use, psychosis, or high pain tolerance. Now we have nomenclature of the OC canister. You have your safety cover at the top, the actuator, which is where you press down the button on, the valve stem, which connects the tube to the actuator. Then you have the tube, which the liquid comes up through, the canister, which obviously is the whole container itself, and the formula, which is inside, and then, of course, the nozzle where the spray comes out. Make sure you know the nomenclature of that for the test. Psychological decontamination. All right. Tell the contaminated person to remain calm and reassure them that the contaminant causes no lasting effects and should dissipate within 20 to 30 minutes. So again, 20 to 30 minutes for OC. Then you have strobing. This is forcefully blinking the eyes using all the muscles in the face. Make sure the person is breathing. Make sure air and water are the two main things that help with OC spray. There is no absolute antidote for chemical agents, but decontaminated solutions such as baby shampoo may decrease contamination effects. Then we have documentation. Using a chemical agent is considered use of force and should be documented accordingly. Weapon retention. Maintaining an appropriate reactionary gap is one of the most effective methods to prevent being disarmed. All right, then we have handgun defense. These techniques rely on several principles to be effective. Surprise. Do not telegraph to the subject that you plan to counterattack. Telegraphing is small eye, hand, or foot movements in the direction that you plan to move. So these were on the test. Remember, telegraphing is small eye, hand, or foot movements in the direction you plan to move. Action is faster than reaction. When you enter the danger zone to deal with the subject, you are the initiator. The subject must react to your threat. Verbal distraction. Reaction time increases when a subject processes two or more pieces of information at the same time. For example, ask the subject a question immediately before taking action. I thought that was a pretty badass thing. So be like, hey, did you notice this was blue? And then just fucking give them a punch right in the face, you know what I mean? So verbal distraction, ask them a question, say something to them, make them think, and then take your defensive action. Then you have physical proximity. To initiate this technique, the subject's handgun must be within arm's reach. All right. Defense against edged weapons. Knife patterns. A knife-wielding subject is likely to use one of the following attack patterns: a straight thrust, an overhead attack with one or two hands, or a forehand slash. Your defensive movements with a knife are to evade, secure, and redirect. So evade is move or pivot away from the attacker. Secure, capture the weapon arm and secure it. Or redirect the weapon arm. Use loud verbal commands before, during, and after the attack. Redirection and evasion techniques. Use redirection and evasion movements to avoid or redirect an edged weapon attack. Then we have deadly force techniques here on our last page. Deadly force is usually associated with the use of a firearm. However, certain empty-hand techniques and unconventional weapons can be used effectively in a deadly force encounter. So remember, with a blunt object, your deadly force is your head, the neck, the side of the neck, the throat, and the groin. With open hand strikes, the only area for deadly force is the throat. A good example is the ground. So empty-hand techniques become deadly force when they have the capability of causing great bodily harm or even death. A good example is a ground fight that turns into a deadly threat when a subject attempts to choke or bite you, gouge your eyes, or grab your gun. If you cannot access a weapon, then an empty-hand technique may help stop or disable your attacker, giving you the chance to recover to a different position. Some empty-hand techniques can become deadly force if applied to a specific target area of the body. Some examples of deadly force techniques may include, but are not limited to, an elbow strike, a throat strike, or an eye gouge. Using alternative weapons. Any item an officer has at hand may be used as a potential weapon in a time of need. In fact, any extension of the body may be a weapon, such as a flashlight, a radio, ballpoint pen, keys, or a pocket knife. It is the use of the item that qualifies the item as a weapon. For instance, a firearm is just a firearm until it is used for a defensive purpose. However, an ashtray or a coffee mug, which is not perceived as a weapon, becomes a weapon if used to strike someone. A deadly weapon is any item used to cause death or great bodily harm. For example, a ballpoint pen directed to the eye becomes a deadly weapon. An officer in a deadly force situation should use unconventional weapons if available and necessary. And that concludes Chapter 4, Criminal Justice Defensive Tactics.